Today, we descend into the smoke-choked streets of 1815 London, a city swollen with empire, but rotting with fear. Inside a quiet household, a young maid serves supper with a smile, placing before her employers a simple dish. Yeast dumplings, steaming and innocent. Within minutes, that supper became agony, writhing bodies, bitter mouths, cries of poison. And when suspicion spread like fire through the room, every gaze turned to her. She was only 20, Irish-born, poor, visible in ways a servant wasn't meant to be. The law called it murder. The jury called it proof. But on the gallows at Newgate, she called what was a lie. So lean in and witness the harrowing case of Eliza Fenning. She raised the dumplings to her lips with a quiet kind of pride. A housemaid was not supposed to sit at the same table as her employers, let alone share in their supper. But that night, April 21st, 1815, the household of Orlebar Turner was in good spirits. The young servant, Elizabeth Eliza Fenning, had prepared the meal herself, a simple dish of yeast dumplings, the kind of food that warms a family in spring's chill. Minutes later, the table dissolved into chaos. Turner's son-in-law, his wife, his mother, and Eliza herself, all doubled over, gasping, retching, their insides aflame. The bread rolls, it seemed, were poisoned. And here's the moment that still clings to the bone 2 centuries later. The young woman, pale and heaving with the same agony as the family she served, is heard pleading, "I am as ill as you. If you are poisoned, I am poisoned too." Imagine that, the supposed villain, suffering right alongside her victims. Her cries echo through trial transcripts, through cheap Victorian penny pamphlets, through the scaffolding at Newgate where she would later be led. But pause on that dinner table. Think of the intimacy of food, the trust in sharing it. Then imagine every mouthful carrying arsenic instead of comfort. A household becomes a crime scene, a meal becomes a death sentence, and a maid becomes a monster or a martyr, depending on who you ask. Eliza Fenning's story is not the neat morality tale the courts pretended it was. It is wrought beneath lace. It is the gothic absurdity of Georgian London, a city that built its order on servants' shoulders, only to crush them at the faintest whisper of suspicion. And all because of dumplings, flour, yeast, and the invisible hand of death. London in 1815 was a city drunk on empire and soot. The air reeked of coal smoke, horse dung, and ambition. Napoleon was rotting in exile. The war machine finally quiet, and England's ruling class could get back to their real passion, hoarding wealth while everyone else starved. Step into the streets and you'd be ankle-deep in mud, dodging pickpockets who looked no older than school children. Gin shops yawned open at every corner. Churches preached virtue on Sundays, and executions provided free entertainment for masses. Justice, if you could call it that, was swift and theatrical, trials lasting hours, hangings drawing crowds in the tens of thousands. It was also an age obsessed with domestic order. A house was a kingdom, ruled by its master, and within its walls, servants orbited like lesser planets. They scrubbed, cooked, washed, and fetched. But they were also watched, distrusted, feared, because servants saw everything. Your drunken arguments, your debts, your affairs. In their hands lay the intimate machinery of life. Your food, your linens, your children's safety. This paranoia created fertile soil for suspicion. Servants were both indispensable and disposable. One misstep, one rumor, and a life could collapse into scandal. And into this brittle landscape walks Eliza Fenning, a young Irish servant, 20 years old, smiling, dutiful, and, according to her employers, sometimes too familiar, too bold, too eager to belong at the family's table. In another world, she had lived an anonymous life, scrubbing pans, perhaps marrying a tradesman, vanishing into the archives of ordinary London poverty. Instead, history grabbed her by the apron strings and hurled her into infamy. Because in 1815, if dumplings made you sick, there was only one story that mattered. The servant girl poisoned you. Eliza Fenning. Say her name out loud. There's something plain about it, almost forgettable, the kind of name that gets buried beneath centuries of dust. And yet, in the spring of 1815, it became infamous, whispered in courts, printed in broadsheets, spat by Londoners as if it belonged to a villain from some penny dreadful play. She wasn't a villain. She wasn't anyone, really. Just 20 years old, a servant girl of Irish descent who worked in the Turner household. Think about what that meant. Youth, poverty, powerlessness. She didn't own her own bed, her time, or her meals. Her life revolved around scrubbing dishes, baking bread, running errands, living in service to people who could enter employment with a single sour glance. The records say she was cheerful, eager to please, but also, how damning this must have sounded in 1815. Forward. Too ready with a smile, too unafraid to joke, too comfortable joining her employers at the dinner table when permitted. In a society obsessed with hierarchy, familiarity from a servant could smell like insolence. And this is where the tragedy of Eliza begins to ferment. She wanted to belong. She wanted to be trusted, seen not as a shadow in the kitchen, but as a human being, part of the family's fabric. She prepared meals not just as a duty, but as gestures of loyalty, of participation in something greater than herself. But what happens when the very thing that defines your place in a household, the food you prepare, the service you give, turns lethal? Suddenly, every smile looks sly. Every gesture reeks of premeditation. Every word is rewritten as evidence of malice. It's cruel irony. Eliza's ambition to be close to her employers may have sealed her fate. They remembered her not as diligent, but as meddlesome. Not as kind, but as suspiciously familiar. A servant who doesn't know her place is dangerous. And when poison entered the room, she became the most convenient suspect. The historians who claw back through the transcripts see it now. She was never really on trial for poisoning dumplings. She was on trial for being visible, for being young, Irish, and female in a system that needed a scapegoat. And scapegoats never walk free. The evening of April 21st, 1815, began like a modest domestic celebration. The Turners had reason to be cheerful. Orlebar Turner, the patriarch, was in good health. His newlywed son-in-law, Charles Gadsden, and his wife were settled into their lives, and the family had gathered for supper. A quiet kind of festivity, one anchored in food. Eliza, eager to please, volunteered to make the dumplings. She kneaded the dough, folded it, boiled it. Every step of the ritual ordinary, even humble. Food was her way of offering herself, of saying, "I belong here, I am part of this." Then came the first bite, and with it, horror. Charles Gadsden was the first to feel it. A bitter, acrid taste. He spat it out, but the sickness surged quickly, twisting his stomach, sending him reeling. His wife followed, gagging, collapsing. Then Orlebar Turner's mother doubled over in pain. And finally, Eliza herself. The household descended into chaos. Convulsions, vomiting, faces white with agony. The cook, a woman named Sarah, claimed she too had tasted the dumplings and fallen ill. Groans echoed through the house. Servants running for water, for a doctor, for answers. Arsenic, that's what it was. White arsenic, the most popular household poison of the age. Easy to obtain, tasteless in small doses but lethal in larger ones. It was everywhere, in rat poison, in cosmetics, in medicine. The 19th century's invisible killer, stored casually in kitchen cupboards, handled without fear. And yet, amid the panic, suspicion took root with terrifying speed. Sarah, the cook, told investigators that Eliza had insisted on making the dumplings herself, that she had hovered over the pot, unusually intent, that she'd been almost gleeful at the chance to cook for the family. That tiny detail, a servant's eagerness, became a knife. And though the entire household had been stricken, though Eliza's own body was racked with the same sickness, by the time the doctor left that night, there was already a name forming on everyone's lips. The poison wasn't in the dumplings, really. It was in the air. Suspicion is a contagion, and Eliza Fenning was already infected. The simplest explanation is often the deadliest. Arsenic in the flour, arsenic in the dumplings. The maid must have done it. That's what the newspapers screamed. But nothing about this case was simple, because arsenic in 1815 was as common as dust. Here's the first crack in the open-and-shut story. The Turner household already kept arsenic on the premises. They used it for killing rats. It was stored in the same kitchen where the dumplings were made, in the same kinds of containers as flour and yeast, a white powder, indistinguishable to the naked eye, in a world without warning labels. Imagine how easy it was for a housemaid to reach for the wrong scoop, and yet Eliza never admitted to an accident. Instead, she insisted she had done nothing wrong, that the ingredients were clean, that she tasted the dumplings herself. If she were plotting murder, why poison her own plate? Some testimony made things even stranger. One servant swore the dumplings tasted fine when raw, before cooking, but bitter afterward. Was it the yeast? Was something added later? Was it cross-contamination from utensils? Suddenly, the mystery sprawled into dozens of unanswered questions. But reason didn't stand a chance against fear. Poison was not just a crime. It was an abomination, a silent, invisible betrayal. Stabbing a man could be forgiven as a crime of passion. Poisoning him was something else entirely. Sneaky, cold-blooded, womanly in its supposed cruelty. The cultural imagination saw it as the ultimate act of treachery. And who was more likely, in the minds of 19th century Londoners, to commit such a crime than a servant who dared to step out of place? The case swelled beyond the Turner household. Neighbors whispered. Broadsheets sold stories of the poisoning maid. Crowds gathered at coffee houses to debate her guilt. She wasn't just a suspect anymore. She was a symbol. And still, the riddle remains. If Eliza really wanted to kill the Turners, why poison herself? Was it arrogance? A miscalculation? Or, more chillingly, was she never guilty at all, just swept into the furnace of her employer's paranoia? Every theory only deepens the fog. And in that fog, the truth dissolves. The investigation, if you can stomach calling it that, was little more than a ritual sacrifice. Once suspicion landed on Eliza, the rest was paperwork. Magistrates arrived, doctors scribbled their opinions, and neighbors chimed with tales of her suspicious familiarity, her forward jokes, her overeagerness in the kitchen. Nothing about evidence, everything about character. They weren't building a case, they were building a narrative. The smiling maid turned snake. And yet, even within this farce, there were jagged contradictions. One account suggested the flour had been tampered with before Eliza ever touched it. Another hinted that the family's son-in-law, Charles Gadsden, had enemies who might have targeted him. Some even muttered about servants' rivalries. Sarah the cook didn't much like Eliza. Jealousy and resentment simmered in every grand house, and poison was a convenient shadow to cast. Doctors didn't agree either. Was it definitely arsenic? Was it in the dumplings alone? Or in the butter sauce they were served with? The scientific methods of the day were crude, relying more on taste and guesswork than chemical certainty. Imagine calling that evidence. Imagine hanging someone on that. And yet they did. Eliza's defense pointed out her own suffering, her lack of motive, the chaos of the kitchen. But prosecution had something stronger than reason: drama. They painted her as cunning, vengeful, embittered by imagined slights. They leaned on the horror of poisoning, the fear of the hidden killer under your roof. And the jury, gentlemen of property, were ready to believe the worst about a servant who smiled too much. Theories swirled outside the courtroom. Some whispered that Orlebar Turner himself had enemies in trade. Others suspected Sarah the cook. Still others suggested an accidental mix-up of flour and poison that nobody wanted to admit, because admitting it would make the household look incompetent. But inside the courtroom, only one theory mattered. Eliza Fenning poisoned the dumplings. That was the story. And once that story took root, it became unshakable, no matter how many cracks showed in its foundation. The trial should have been laughable, if laughter weren't choked by the noose waiting at the end of it. Eliza's crime was nothing more than a handful of suspicions woven into a morality play, and yet the courtroom turned it into theater. The judge stared her down like she was already guilty. The prosecutor sharpened his words into poison more lethal than anything found in dumplings. Witness after witness painted her as strange, meddlesome, too familiar, an Irish maid who smiled at the wrong times. Not evidence, not facts, just gossip dressed up in wigs and robes. Eliza herself broke down during the proceedings. Imagine her voice trembling, rising, pleading, "I am innocent. I am as innocent as a child unborn. But innocence was never the point. The performance had to end with a villain, and the audience wanted blood. The turning point came with terrifying swiftness. After hearing conflicting testimonies, the jury barely stepped away before returning with their verdict: guilty. No forensic certainty, no proof of intent, just a consensus that someone must pay, and the maid was the cheapest currency available. That verdict shattered more than Eliza's life. It stripped bare the machinery of early 19th century justice. How easy it was to transform suspicion into guilt, eagerness into malice, poverty into crime. The court wasn't delivering justice. It was delivering reassurance. The public needed to believe the threat of poison had a face, a name, a body to hang. Eliza collapsed in despair. Witnesses described her as hysterical, gasping, near fainting as the sentence was read: death by hanging, at Newgate Prison, for dumplings. This was the breakdown, the moment reason lost, the moment paranoia triumphed. The trial wasn't about whether Eliza poisoned anyone. It was about maintaining order, about reinforcing the idea that servants knew their place. She had dared to smile, to eat, to join, and so she would swing. History is filled with miscarriages of justice, but few collapse so quickly, so utterly, and so mercilessly. The official resolution came on July 26, 1815. Newgate Prison, a gallows crowded with spectators, the air stinking of sweat and anticipation. Eliza Fenning, 20 years old, pale but resolute, walked to her death. She declared her innocence until the last moment. No confessions, no convenient repentance to soothe the crowd. Her final words were a knife in the state's stomach, a public reminder that justice had killed a woman who swore she had done nothing wrong. The law considered the matter resolved. The poisoned dumplings had their culprit. The Turners had been avenged. The city could sleep easier, believing the treacherous maid had been caught. But the questions wouldn't die. Why had Eliza poisoned herself if she truly intended murder? Why was no one else in the household seriously investigated when arsenic was accessible to all? Why were the medical examinations so contradictory? And why did the jury ignore the possibility of an accident in a world where arsenic was practically seasoning? Pamphlets circulated, many of them sympathetic to Eliza. Radical writers painted her as a victim of class prejudice, a scapegoat for a paranoid society. Some suggested the Turners themselves covered up their own mistake, the wrong ingredient used, the wrong jar taken down from the shelf, and offered up Eliza to preserve their reputation. And so the case never really closed. It calcified into a story half believed, half feared, a ghost hovering over every kitchen where arsenic and flour shared a shelf. Lingering questions have longer lives than verdicts. And Eliza's questions still whisper across the centuries, like the aftertaste of something bitter hidden in a meal. London didn't forget Eliza Fenning, though the city tried to. Officialdom wanted her memory filed away as justice served, but the public, the public, couldn't quite let go. Her hanging sparked outrage, not just among radicals, but among ordinary citizens who saw in her death a grotesque reflection of themselves. If a maid could be condemned on such flimsy grounds, what safety was left for anyone without money or power? Pamphleteers tore into the trial. They called it a judicial murder, a stain on the record of British justice. Even Charles Dickens, years later, would reference the Fenning case as an emblem of corruption, a story that exposed the cruelty of a system more concerned with appearances than truth. And in the quieter corners of London, the case left psychic scars. Servants whispered about her fate, reminding each other that loyalty could mean nothing, that one accident or one malicious rumor could end in a hangman's rope. Employers, too, were unsettled. If Eliza was guilty, then poison might lurk in any kitchen. If she was innocent, then the courts would convict anyone on a whisper. Neither possibility brought comfort. The legacy metastasized. Eliza's name became a symbol, invoked in arguments for legal reform, cited whenever the machinery of justice seemed too quick, too cruel. She wasn't the first innocent hanged, nor the last, but she became a reference point, a shorthand for what happens when paranoia feeds on class prejudice and devours truth. And there's another legacy, darker, quieter, the enduring cultural terror of poisoned food. Even today, when you read thrillers or watch films with a meal high to lethal secret, You're touching the same nerve Eliza's story exposed. That primal fear that what sustains you could destroy you. That trust itself could be fatal. Eliza Fenning never lived to know she'd become a symbol. She died a servant, condemned for dumplings. But her ghost still lingers, not in the Turner household, not in Newgate Prison, but in the idea that justice can starve itself of reason until it feasts only on flesh. Picture this: a young woman, condemned to die, standing on the scaffold, staring down at the crowd that came to watch her swing. They gawked, some jeered, some wept. The city treated it as spectacle, as punishment, as reassurance that order still held. But what if every person there carried home a piece of poison that day? Not the arsenic in the dumplings, the poison of certainty, the smug certainty that they knew the truth, that justice had been done, that the world was neat, orderly, fair. That poison seeps deeper than arsenic ever could, and it lingers for centuries, infecting every system that prefers a quick conviction to an uncomfortable doubt. Eliza Fenning's death is not a closed case. It's a mirror. Hold it up, and you see how quickly suspicion can turn into evidence, how easily class can masquerade as guilt, how the machinery of justice grinds not toward truth, but toward sacrifice. She didn't just die on Newgate's scaffold. She died every time a servant was distrusted for smiling too much, every time a woman was condemned for being too forward, every time the poor were crushed beneath the weight of the rich man's fear. And maybe that's the real horror here. That arsenic didn't kill Eliza Fenning. London did. A city starved of compassion, desperate for order, hungry for a body to hang. And history swallowed her whole, leaving us with nothing but the bitter aftertaste of dumplings and doubt. Hello everyone, and thank you so much for listening. As usual, please leave any comment or feedback you may have, and I hope to see you all again in the next case.